Hello and welcome to this most recent episode of the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. Usually, I use this moment to tell you a bit more about ourselves, but I don't want to repeat what you may already know. Just know that I'm the pastor of Northwood Christian Church. You can find more about us at our website if you want to, www.indyncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. There you can find our contact information, and if you want to reach out, you can either write into our office or to me, your pastor, or you can call. And also, before we push on to where I'm wanting to take this, I want you to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and distributed by the All Indiana Podcast Network, which you can discover more about at allindianapodcastnetwork.com or theallindianapodcastnetwork.com or by typing in www.wishtv.com/podcasts. And in that vein, while we're talking podcasts and the people that distribute it and hopefully spreading the message, I would like to take a moment to encourage you to like, subscribe, or to follow this podcast on whatever platform that you use. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit subscribe. Or if you're listening to this on Spotify, hit follow. More subscriptions and followers means that the algorithms on the internet, the algorithms of these platforms will lead our podcast to more listeners. And even better, maybe you want to think about leaving a review. I'm told that reviews also boost traffic, but also it would just be good to hear from you and to receive feedback about what we're doing here and maybe some useful suggestions or comments or critiques. But moving on, today we're going over a Bible passage found in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 22 through 31. But first, we'll pause for an ad break for our listening audience. And we're back. As I said just a moment ago, we're going to be considering a Bible passage found in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verses 22 through 31. And I won't beat around the bush. It reads, "Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, 'Athenians, I see how extremely spiritual you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands. Nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, he made all peoples to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps fumble about for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have to the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This message is about idols. In fact, it's called About Idols. Maybe that was just me phoning it in when naming this, but it was hard for me to give this talk a name. But before we really get going, I gotta say, I just love this story, the one we just read. I have as long as I can remember hearing it. I first read it or heard it read from the pulpit at my childhood church. I think probably that's the first place I heard it. I can remember at least hearing it from the pulpit at my childhood church more than once. And I've reflected through the week as to why this story was so enjoyable to me as a child. And I think I've concluded that it's because of the very existence of the unknown God and the implications behind the idea. For you see, I didn't know that one could face an unknown God with sincerity, worship that God, and that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would receive that worship as done to them. So no, that was not what I was taught. I was taught something very different. I was taught that there were all kinds of people out there with wrong ideas, and that what Paul was doing here in this story was beating them in some sort of rhetorical display of force. And this passage was spoken of as if Paul had shown up on the Romans' home turf to beat them at their own game. I can remember what it felt like when I listened to what feels like many sermons, which wouldn't surprise me because this is a fairly popular one. And in those sermons, I can remember the first line of the text was sometimes read something like this, quoting from the King James Bible. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, "Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious." You may have picked up on some of the differences in translation there. Of course, it's the King James, so it's a lot of ye's and they's and thou's. Old-time English. But there are others as well. And I read from the King James Version of the Bible just to point out some of the differences in translation. For one, the place is called Mars Hill, and in the King James, in the version we read today, Areopagus, as is in most other translations, and it makes no difference. Areopagus means Hill of Ares, also known as Mars to the Romans. You get it. But that last line has a difference that matters, at least in tone, depending on how you translate it. You are too superstitious, and rest assured we are meant to hear derision directed at these so-called would-be worshipers. That word translated in today's text as extremely spiritual, which is what it's translated as in the translation that I chose, and then too superstitious in the King James, comes from a Greek word that is used only once in the whole Bible. So we don't have a lot of other passages, no other passages to compare its usage to and translations to. It's only used here in this verse that we're discussing, but we can look at other ancient sources and find that same Greek word used as sometimes a derisive smear, but then sometimes as a compliment. Both. It's a neutral word. Sometimes it can mean just what the preachers I grew up listening to thought it meant, those silly, superstitious Romans. Or it can mean what the translation I chose, the New Revised Standard Version, says, that they were extremely spiritual in every way, as Paul said it. And this is not a negative comment and could even be an affirmation. And I just want to point out before we move on that to translate this word in a negative way here, in Acts 17, verse 22, that's a choice that we don't need to make. It may be a choice others want to make so as to differentiate true and pious believers from the alleged superstitious, but still, this would be a choice that we'd be making on purpose, maybe to disparage someone. If we were being objective, we'd probably choose a different word. The translators of the NRSV and many others have not only given us a more charitable, accurate translation of this verse, but reading it this way makes what comes later make even more sense, which is another reason that I prefer it to say that you are very spiritual as opposed to superstitious. Because later, you wouldn't get the idea that Paul thinks that the people that he's addressing are spiritually vacant at all. In fact, what he says next has challenged Christians to be less rigid in our beliefs about where God is and where God isn't, who God is with and who God is not with, we think. Instead, he gives us a better way to view God's movement in the world. Paul's thesis can be basically summed up in verses 24 and 25, which read, "The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things." emphasis on all. God gives life to all mortals. And this means that in the broadest sense, we are all distant kin, at the very least, even brothers and sisters, if we could come to see it that way, sharing a common source and ancestry. And this point is even made by way of Paul's rhetorical technique, which I want to point out. To emphasize the potential unity of humanity, Paul draws from religious texts here, as he's trying to convince them, compel them to follow Jesus, draws from religious texts and sources completely outside of his tradition. Don't miss this. Paul quotes two lines that are actually from Greek poetry and philosophy, lines hundreds of years old by the time he quoted them, well known and revered, at least in some circles. You can read those two lines from Greek philosophy and poetry in verse 28, which read, "For in him we live and move and have our being." That's one of the quotes. And then he goes on to say, "Even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring." That's the other. And that first line, "In God we live and move and have our being," that echoes a hymn that was written to Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, written by a Cretan philosopher named Epimenides. Epimenides, we'll say. And the second line, "For we too are his offspring," was written by a Stoic philosopher, direct quote, named Aratus. So note this. Here Paul quotes Greek philosophers, in one instance reference to a hymn written to a different god entirely. And he does not dismiss what he finds there. Instead, he names the truth and wisdom that he finds there. And here I read no condescension, but the most memorable rhetorical move Paul makes here is to convince his audience to follow Jesus by way of mentioning an idol that has been made to the unknown God. He says, "I've been looking around and I've seen that you are very spiritual. I like that. I've seen some of your gods, and there's one called the unknown God." And here someone coughs. "You mean the utterly false God." And you'd think that this is what it read after listening to some of the sermons that I've heard on this passage, but no, it's not what it says. It says unknown God, implying that there is a God there. But just who it is seems unclear. Who God is can often seem unclear, is sometimes very unclear. Paul, after noting how spiritual they are, seeking wisdom, seeking the divine, that's what they're doing, calls what they're doing worship, actual worship. He said, "What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." So notice, they are worshiping something, and Paul suggests that they are worshiping the same God that he has come to know through Jesus Christ. So what is the problem? It's the idols. God is always near. We bring God nearer by way of our religious rituals and practices, but sometimes we make an idol or many idols. And this was Paul's real problem here because he, as he said, God cannot be contained in brick and mortar, stone, or statue. And then Paul uses the Romans' own belief system to describe the ways that God was the source of life to us all, and that indeed God is not far from each one of us, as Paul put it. So again, this is a huge concession to make for some, that God is near us all. But maybe not for Paul. Either way, he says that no matter who you are, where you are, God is right there. We might fumble about for God sometimes, as he noted, but he is just under our nose. And again, the problem is the idols. We try to capture God, who is everywhere and for everyone, in a small box. And the Romans made many literal stone and wood idols. And they made them, and when they made them after what they thought of as their gods, plural, most valued attributes. So Ares, on whose hill this conversation was taking place, was the god of war. And there you can make a reasonable point. Sometimes we craft our idols after our own worst impulses. God of war. And we do this today. We may not be worshiping literal stone idols in North America in 2023, but we certainly do have idols And how do you know what your idols are? The theologian Paul Tillich wrote a lot about this, about faith in God versus faith in idols. And of this, he wrote, quote, "Faith is a total and centered act of the personal self, the act of unconditional, infinite, and ultimate concern." What does that mean? So if you want to know what your faith is in, think about what you spend the most time thinking about, pining for, and striving towards. Think about the objects and symbols that represent these passions. Your most ultimate concern might be symbolized by the markers of your religion, its symbols and practices, or your ultimate concern might be symbolized by a nation's colors and flag, or your ultimate concern might find some other form of symbol. I've even seen someone get a $sign tattooed on their body. More than once I've seen that. So there's a symbol of a possible ultimate concern. The problem is when the symbol becomes our God, or when our ultimate concern becomes something lower, even unholy, then we make an idol. I'd like to read another quote from Paul Tillich that I think describes what might happen when a nation state has become an idol. Quote, "If a national group makes the life and growth of the nation its ultimate concern, it demands that all other concerns, economic, well-being, health and life, family, aesthetic, and cognitive truth, justice, and humanity be sacrificed. Everything is centered in the only God, the nation, a God who certainly proves to be a demon, but who shows clearly the unconditional character of ultimate concern." So there's that. But there are many other idols. Other people, other passions. Money is a very compelling idol. I've mentioned it already once, and it seems to be many people's ultimate concern, perhaps most people's. Even our religious icons, even the cross that we Christians revere, can become an idol if we forget that it is but a symbol for the transformative power beyond it. It is against these tendencies that Paul warned the Roman Empire of on that hill. And then he concluded, "Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent." And then in the last line, he points to Jesus, who was for him what is written in Colossians 1:15, that he is the image of the invisible God. And as such, he showed us what it looks like to be a human, to be wholly absorbed, a human who is totally absorbed by God's priorities. So much so that the line between humanity and divinity in him blurred as to be no distinction. Jesus brought life and love with him and restored what was broken around him. So here is another image of the invisible God, not all of the image, but perhaps the image most relative for humanity as a human himself and divine. For after all, don't we need a fellow traveler to show us the way? Paul believed that Jesus was such a one. And here, after he has named the idolatry, he calls for the people to repent. And they were implored to turn away from the gods of stone to something more transcendent. In fact, to the transcendent one. The same call to repent and to turn to the ways of Jesus is just right here, still today. Remember, God is always near us all. In God we move and have our being. All we need is to identify and then reject the idols that distract us. Greed and idolatrous nationalism, I think, are the biggies. Seems like for many, our ultimate concern is our nation and the perseverance of its wealthy status at any and all costs. And one might give a slight nod to the cross of Jesus or sleep through a prayer, but don't you dare disrespect the flag, and you'd better stand up as the national hymn is sung. Jesus, in this paradigm, seems a bigger and better Captain America instead of the image of the invisible God. So we'll take our Jesus so long as he is wedded to Lady Liberty and personal friends with Uncle Sam. I name these things not to be overly political. But notice, I've not named a political affiliation, and I think that all sides of the political spectrum feed this idolatry that I now name idolatrous nationalism. But here, the writer of the book of Acts presents us with an alternative. We can repent, reject our idols, and remember again the God who made the world and everything in it. He who is Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in shrines made by human hands. And we can, when we can, remember this God, we remember that God's concern is for us, not just our own homelands, but for all the peoples and nations of the world. We remember that God not only cares about those in our household, but for our neighbors and for strangers as well. We remember that God's heart breaks just as easily for someone killed by a bomb overseas as it breaks for our own loved ones when they die. Same. When we can remember this God, we remember how God's Son Jesus showed care and compassion for all he met, rejecting the allures of fame and wealth, and even giving all of his entire self for what he believed was right. Could be that's what it takes before our idols fall. So give of yourself to the God of us all, the God who is over all. Because, thing is, all of these idols, they will eventually fade or turn to dust. So let's instead devote ourselves to who and to what really matters in the end. To the God who is over all, and to each other in the name of love. This has been the Northwood Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen, or leave a comment. These points of engagement drive more traffic our way. Or check out our website, www.indyncc.org, and also check out the other podcasts produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Northwood Podcast. I am Heath Jones. Peace.